We can look at this as punishment, or we can look at this as the rules of the game that the quicker we learn and choose to play with, the quicker we can be successful.
It's Matt Kirchner, host of the Tech Ed Podcast. We are the #1 podcast in all of STEM and technical education. Have to tell the audience, I was spending a little time a couple weeks ago just browsing through the Wall Street Journal, as I often do, and it just occurred to me, believe it or not, one day in the Wall Street Journal online, 9 articles on the topic of artificial intelligence in just one day. I added up about a year ago the number of articles that showed up in a month, and it was like 57, 58 articles. Now, it's interesting. First of all, AI is all anybody can talk about. We talk about it all the time here, of course, on the Tech Ed Podcast, usually around generative pre-trained transformers. We talk about embodied AI. We talk about physical AI. We talk about business process automation. We talk about how individual organizations are using AI. A little bit less so on today's topic, which is going to be fascinating. That is all around compliance, security, ethical use of artificial intelligence, some of the standards that are involved with artificial intelligence. It's going to be a really, really fascinating aspect of artificial intelligence that we have not delved too much into here on the podcast. So super, super excited to welcome to this episode the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation for an organization called Align. That organization's VP of Strategy and Innovation is none other than Patrick Sullivan, who joins me in the studio today. Patrick, so awesome to have you here.
Matt, thank you so much for the opportunity to come speak. Grateful to be here. I really am.
You're doing such really, really fascinating work, and you know, we're going to get into a little bit of my experience in advanced manufacturing and some of the quality standards and compliance issues that we ran into and were really, really important, I should say, in the world of advanced manufacturing. And now we're seeing the crossover of a lot of these different topics into the world of artificial intelligence. You are at the heart of that. You're doing some really, really cool work at Align, and so that's what we want to get into. We're going to talk about, and we're going to make them exciting, right? I mean, if I were to say, hey, we're going to talk about cybersecurity and governance, the whole audience would be tuning out, and they'd come see us next Tuesday. In this particular case, just knowing the work you're doing, we're going to make this a really fascinating conversation. The first thing, where I want to start, when we talk about products, what would fit into that basket, and when we talk about compliance, what types of compliance, how are we thinking about compliance? Just want to make sure our audience has the context for the dialogue.
Really, really good question. So when we talk product, it really depends on where in the world you sit. So in the U.S., we typically think of product in the context of AI as being software, but we have this intangible thing that we're shipping to market, that we're making available to the market so that consumers can use it. When we shift the lens, when we flip the focus, however, to the European Union, what we see through the EU AI Act is this hard focus on product as being both tangible and intangible. That is a strong recognition that in tangible devices, like medical devices, for example, that we can layer in software, artificial intelligence, so that that product, which is the combination of the two, again, tangible and intangible, it's what's being delivered to the market, and therefore what requires protections to ensure product safety. Now, compliance, Matt, really is just conformity, for lack of better words. So we have various bodies. Some are driven by international standards. Some are driven by regulation. Some are driven by market groups. As an example, PCI, the PCI data security standard. Those different bodies will create frameworks around which organizations will tend to need to conform their practices and procedures to show that they are compliant.
Got it. So I'm going to, because we talk a lot about manufacturing on the podcast, I want to draw a couple parallels and make sure I'm getting it, again, for the context for our audience. I think about working in the world of manufacturing. For example, for 10 years, I ran the largest contract metal finishing operation in the United States, a spinoff of Rockwell Automation. And that goes back quite a ways. But in that business, right, we had a few different things. First of all, we had government regulations. So you think about the Resource Recovery and Reclamation Act. You talk about the Clean Air and Water Act, and understanding, all right, there's the federal government is promulgating these expectations that we're going to comply with. You think about waste effluent, or for lack of a better term, the water that's leaving our plant is complying with certain standards for metals, for pH, for volatile organic compounds, and so on. So we've got the compliance with the regulatory requirements. We were also ISO, in that case, 9002. So
Right.
It's a registration that a lot of folks are familiar with. It's not a governmental requirement. It is a set of standards that say, we're going to comply to these standards. We're going to have an outside certification body that's going to come in and ensure that we are compliant to them. So that would be an example. And then I was a member of, for example, at the time, the American Electroplaters and Surface Finishers Society, which
Yeah.
promulgated certain expectations for its members that said, hey, you're gonna act in this particular fashion. So am I understanding right that your three categories are exactly the same, but for software and embedded AI and physical assets?
Absolutely. And to take that a step further, thinking about Rockwell Automation, the
Sure.
programmable logic controllers, the
Yeah.
PLCs. Did you ever use RS Logics to?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
So we've got RS Logic that allows us to create ladder logic, this complex way of thinking and working through a series of yes, no questions that can energize outputs, take inputs. That's comparable to the intangible component of what we call AI today. The PLCs themselves, the tangible component, the two go together, and suddenly we have this product that ships as a single unit and brings value as a single unit.
Mm-hmm.
But there are still instances where we treat each of those components separately.
Awesome. Perfect analogy. I'm proud to say, number one, that Blake Moret, the chairman and CEO of Rockwell Automation, is a former guest on the podcast. So you'll be
Awesome.
glad to know that. And he's
Yep.
actually a little bit of prognostication for our audience. Will be joining us again later this year. We've got that episode lined up. So we'll bring Blake back on to talk
Awesome.
about the great things they're making. As a quick aside, $1 billion investment in a huge manufacturing plant in the Midwest. And so excited to have Blake on to talk about RS Logics, to talk about programmable logic controllers, the evolution from the SLC 500 and even before, and the PLC 4s and so on, to the the incredible compact logics work and control logic work that they've been doing of late. So super excited for that. But that gives our audience the context. So now if I'm a software company and I'm developing software, I'm, to your point, Patrick, I'm a medical company and I'm creating a monitoring device of some sort that becomes what we call, whether it's cyber physical systems, or some people would call it embedded AI, embodied AI, applied AI, physical AI. We've talked a little bit. I don't know if we've mentioned it on the podcast. We should link it up in the show notes, Melissa. Jensen Huang did his presentation at the Consumer Electronics Show. Jensen, of course, being the CEO of NVIDIA. And he got up at the Consumer Electronics Show, huge show in Las Vegas back in November, and said that we've evolved from generative AI and the early stage generative AI being able to recognize images and recognize text, to produce our own text and images using artificial intelligence, to now we're at the point of what we've been saying on the podcast, and this is, people can go back and validate this. The real future of artificial intelligence, in my opinion, is the physical AI, the embedded AI, the applied AI, how it manifests itself in whether it's medical equipment, manufacturing equipment, office equipment. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? So now I'm getting a flavor for the work that you're doing and putting it into a context that might be a little bit more recognizable to our audience in terms of a lot of the conversation. And since we've talked about medical, we've talked about the financial model, we've talked about factories, manufacturing, education.
Mhm.
When you think about, maybe, I don't know if flawed decision is the right word. Maybe it is, Patrick, you can tell me. But in terms of making a flawed decision around some of these technologies as AI manifests itself in those technologies, how do you find what a flawed decision might be? And are the leadership teams of these organizations thinking enough about that before they're deploying the technology into the market?
Yeah, and largely what we see today, right or wrong, is that organizations are trying to keep up with the Joneses.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see organizations make a determination that in order to continue to market their products or services the way that their competitors are, they should be AI enabled,
Yep.
whatever that means. And so we do see, again, right or wrong, the decision to implement AI in tools wherein AI might not necessarily add direct value other
Mm-hmm.
than marketing. So
Yep.
I do think that's a significant issue that we're facing today, and one in which I really ask executives to stop back and ask themselves the question, do we need AI to do this?
Mm-hmm.
If the answer is no, then let's not deploy those tools. Because, Matt, one of the things that we haven't discussed is governance as a practice is really a value creation practice. It's about recognizing desired outcomes at optimized risk and cost. And so risk and cost have to be optimized, not eliminated. That'll never happen, but have to be optimized in context of that which we really hope to create. And frankly, one of the biggest risks I see today is unclear business outcomes
Mm-hmm.
defined as part of the strategy to deploy AI.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned so much of this. So much of what we talk about here on the podcast is exactly what you've just mentioned, Patrick. I think back to my years in manufacturing, and whether it was ISO and the big push toward ISO 9002 in manufacturing starting in the mid 90s, maybe a little bit sooner, and to 2010. And it was a question of a lot of companies were saying, well, we need to be ISO because our manufacturers, our customers are asking for it. Okay, I mean, that's not a bad reason, but is it really adding value, and are you doing it in a way that's adding value to your company and actually improving quality and customer experience? And then we had this whole push toward Kaizen and continuous improvement, and it was the same thing, or lean manufacturing probably even before that. It's like, well, we need to be lean. We need to, bring all these lean tools to market, or to bear rather, in our processes. So whether it was, Hoshin Kanri, or it was 5S, or it was Six Sigma, we have to do this. It's like, to what end? Does it add value or not? And then to the Kaizen point, it's like, well, we need to do a Kaizen event. Well, what problem are you solving? Is that the same thing on the AI front? Do you see companies saying, well, everybody else is talking about AI, we need a solution here, rather than really looking at the customer experience, the use of the product, and whether artificial intelligence actually adds value to that customer experience or not?
Without question, we see it on a daily basis, Matt. And it's very unfortunate because we do see organizations making significant investment without necessarily recognizing that the value proposition doesn't exist. MIT, maybe,
Yeah. Okay.
maybe 2 years ago, released a study that said enterprise organizations that they had interviewed through the study, only about 3% were recognizing a real return on investment from the deployment of AI tools.
Yep.
And the first question I had for those authors is, what was the value proposition? Had they defined a business case wherein they could be successful, or were we simply deploying tools hoping that something would magically come to fruition?
Yep. I love that. Yeah, it's a really, really good way to think about it. And for anybody that's innovating, and we are in this era, right? And it's even on steroids. I mean, there was that period of time where if you weren't talking about Kaizen, you weren't talking about lean, you weren't talking about standardized quality, that you didn't have a seat at the table.
Right.
And now it's become AI as that topic. It's so really driving back whether we're using AI in education, whether we're using it in industry, whether we're using it in government and policy. I mean, whatever that application is, what's the value? It's a little bit like, to use a lean term, and think about the 7 deadly wastes and the idea of overproduction. And if we're building capability into a product that a customer isn't willing to pay for, that's waste, right? And it's the same thing here. You can build AI into a product. If the customer isn't willing to pay more for whatever benefit comes from that, you're wasting capital and you're wasting effort.
And that we see it happening even worse today, in that organizations are enabling AI services and products that have already made it through their customers' third-party risk management processes, and they aren't notifying them that those AI services have been enabled.
Right.
So effectively, we're creating blind spots in the market, blind spots of risk, only because we're not communicating what it is we're actually attempting to do.
Right. Absolutely. So if I've got, let's just take, we started kind of in the space of software and embedded AI in a medical device. If I'm an organization that is in that space, one or the other or both, and I'm thinking about innovation in my product, what question do I need to answer? I mean, yes, does it add value or not, but how do you go about discerning that, or maybe you're asking the right questions in the organization about whether or not you should be embedding AI and going down this AI journey for the product?
Yeah, and I think the question is the same question, Matt, and I hate to keep coming back to
Yeah,
this,
go.
but is this an instance where AI can legitimately bring more value to the process? Do we need to create a new agent or entity to create value or shift value? That is innovation.
Right.
Probably not the best definition in the world, but
Perfect.
ultimately
Yeah.
it's innovation that we're looking
Yep.
for. If that is the case, then what we see through ISO, through its various management systems, as you've seen in the past with 9001, is a pragmatic procedural set of not necessarily requirements, though they are requirements, but of thought processes that we as an organization should work through to ensure that we're making a good decision, and to ensure that we can continue to support that decision when things get difficult, because they will.
Absolutely. And as you're right, they're not necessarily requirements, they're standards. You can think about them as best practices.
That's correct.
You can think of them in deploying them in a way that makes sense for your organization. That was one of the things that, I learned really early on in the ISO space, and it might be ISO 9001 or 9002 in manufacturing processes. I've been involved in 14001 on the environmental side. I've been in 18001 on the safety side. And of course, there's dozens and dozens and hundreds of different ISO standards along the line, but certainly been through my share of creating quality systems that were ISO compliant, and then going through the process of getting them, getting the initial audit done, getting the accreditation, and then the compliance auditing on a regular basis, been down that road. It's a fascinating process to go through, but to your point, it really is about adding value for customer. And I think, ISO really morphed in my experience 20, 25 years ago from, hey, this is the quality police that are saying you have to do this in order to be compliant, to how are we using the standard to add value, not just on the quality compliance side, but really expanding that to customer experience in general and becoming a much broader standard. So I think it leads to another question for as long as we're on this topic of ISO, and that is a lot of our audience members are going to be familiar with the ISO standards as they apply to advanced manufacturing. You're telling me that we have similar standards in the world of AI?
Oh, do we ever? Do we
Yeah.
ever? In December of 2023, ISO finalized and released internationally standard 42001. You'll hear it referred to as 42001, 42001, but it is the standard that helps organizations build, implement, and then operationalize, run over time, their AI management system, or simply AIMS. Those of you that are interested, check it out. It is well worth the investment if either innovation or AI are on your roadmap somewhere.
Got it. So let's go a little bit deeper on that, because I'm honestly fascinated by this. So I'm a company
Definitely.
that is innovating an end customer product, and I'm developing and embedding AI into that product. Give us some examples of what's in that standard that I would be complying to, or that I would build either my manufacturing, my production, my innovation, or my quality system around.
Sure. So every ISO management system standard is organized around what's referred to as a high-level structure. And so what we have in ISO management system standards, not technical guidance, not technical standards, management system standards, are a common framework of what are called clauses, which are the core management requirements, the commitments that management must make, and then annex controls, which are ways that we can control risk that might be present in the environment. But as we look at the clauses for ISO 42001, what we'll see is the core requirements exist in clause 4 through 10. Clause 4, with every ISO management system, tells organizations, look, I know you're busy, I know you want to work fast, but before you do anything else, stop and think about the context of your organization. What environment are you operating in from a regulatory perspective, from a cultural perspective? What services are you delivering? What risks are part of the environment in which you choose to play? What customer contractual agreements do you have? The whole biography of your organization really has to be laid out plainly so that anything else will make sense. With your context in place, clause 5 says, look, now that you know who you are, if
Right.
we're really going to do this, you need to make a commitment. So clause 5 is all about leadership. Leadership's commitment to ensuring that this management system can be implemented, operationalized, and then maintained over time. Clause 6 is all about support. Once leaders say, yes, we're going to do this, where we see things fall apart in systems that weren't managed well, leaders say, let's get this done, but then offer no support whatsoever in ensuring that the systems that are deployed can be cared for, can be grown, can be any of the things that happen with evolution. I'm sorry, I called that clause 6. That's clause 7.
Got it.
Clause 6 is about designing the core infrastructure that has to be implemented. Then we force management to say, yes, we'll support this over time. Clause 8 of every ISO management system says now that we have a clear understanding of who we are, we know what it is that we want to do, we know that we're going to get support to do this, let's implement this framework, this set of tools, again, the operating system for our environment so that we can be successful. And then the heart of every management system, every ISO management system, is what's referred to as the Deming loop. Matt, I know you're very familiar with this.
Yep.
We commit to plan, do, check, act over and over and over again. So clauses 9 and 10 are about having metrics and a commitment to continuous improvement. So we, through the management system, set operational parameters, metrics that we continue to monitor. And in the event that we find that our outcomes are drifting from expectation, we supply feedback, either balancing feedback or reinforcing feedback, whichever is appropriate. But we ensure that this management system, through the simple act of creating a structure built around these clauses, continues to grow in a positive way over time.
And then in somewhere in that space, I'm assuming we have some version of standard operating procedures that says this is how our organization is going to comply. Is that right?
So that's what the organization is responsible for. Again, the beauty of ISO management systems is that they're meant to be extended to meet the needs of the organization in its context.
Right.
And so ISO through its management system is not going to say, hey, Matt, we want you to have 3 people running this particular process on this particular day, because that might not work for your environment. What it does say is you should have someone accountable to do this generic process. Then you as an organization have an opportunity to create the procedure that supports that.
Absolutely. And so the SOPs exist on the company side, not within the standard.
Not
On
within the
the other
standard.
hand, yeah, if
Correct.
you have them, you have to follow them. At least in my days of ISO,
That's it.
if you've created an SOP, you can be specific to your organization, your customers, your processes, and so on. But if you say you're going to do it, then you have to do it.
And that's where the integrity component of ISO management systems come in through internal audit, which is a requirement from your ISO management system perspective. You have an opportunity to determine if your words align with your actions.
Got
Is
it.
what we're saying we're doing, what we're actually doing.
Yep,
It's an integrity check that drives the positive feedback that
for
keeps us
sure.
moving in the right direction.
Yeah, say what you do and do what you say is the way that we used to explain it to folks on the shop floor, right? It's
That's
it.
it, man.
Yeah.
That's it. It's very simple. Very
Yep,
simple.
exactly. Well, it's simple in theory, and in practice, that's where the
Simple
details
but not
become
easy.
a little
Yeah,
bit more
simple but not easy.
complicated. So when we think about those SOPs or those processes that are specific to an organization, Patrick, give me. I mean, it's just a question for understanding how this would work in practice. What
Mhm.
kinds of expectations, what kind of processes are we talking about? What kind of things are people or organizations saying, here's how we're going to do it? And then obviously the ISO layer it over to the top to make sure that they're compliant.
So a couple of big examples, man, are risk management. So what we'll see through ISO 27001, which is the
Hmm.
management system around information security in an
Yep.
environment, exists in a similar way in ISO 42001, where an ISO tells us if we're going to be deploying AI systems, we need to have some mechanism to assess risk.
Sure.
And so that risk assessment methodology, that risk assessment process is a requirement of the standard. How it's implemented and executed is largely up to the organization to determine.
Got
There
it.
are some thresholds, some key criteria that must be met, but outside meeting those key criteria, how you choose to assess the risk, the AI specific risk of your systems is going to be largely up to you and your context.
Got it. Yeah, as long as you're following those what those processes are as you've defined them. And so if we think about Patrick, we've talked about industry, manufacturing, we've talked a little bit about the medical space, about the software space. I want to pivot a little bit on, staying on the same topic, but let's think about how that applies in the world of education. We've
Sure.
got a lot of folks that are leading institutions of education. Had a meeting this morning with a superintendent. We talked to chancellors, presidents of technical colleges, universities. I mean, lots of people that are leading change in education. A lot of them, especially as we get into this age of artificial intelligence, are really asking two questions. The first one is, how do I take this incredible sea of information that I have about my students? So they've got, I tell educators that people in manufacturing would kill to have the kind of information about their customers and
Right.
products that we have in education. We know our students, we know their backgrounds, we know where they live, we know their extracurricular activities. Somebody said last week we even know what they're eating for lunch. We know all about their academic performance, what they're selecting for coursework, how they're performing. We have all of this data, and they're asking two questions. How do I use that data and maybe AI to be able to cater to the specific student in a way that is more beneficial to them and elicits a more efficient learning journey for the student, but doing that in a way that I comply with regulations, that I secure the
Mhm.
data, and so on. We get that question all the time. And in the same way in business, we worry about operational and reputational risk, I think. How do you address realities? Let's stay on the education front of trying to innovate in education, trying to use the incredible amount of data that we have, but doing it in a fashion that doesn't slow innovation down, but also doesn't mitigate or set a security risk for the organization.
Yeah, and outside of AI as a tool, which is not what you're describing, you're describing using data about a student, effectively metadata to make
Right?
better decisions as an educational
Sure.
institution.
And then just to be clear, I mean, we could create an LLM with that data. We could use an MCP model and create agentic AI that would then help point us in the right direction. So
So
that's
many
where the
different.
AI would come in.
Yeah, yeah, and man, as opposed to what could we do, because I think there really are unlimited opportunities. I think really my mind immediately goes to special category data like privacy.
Okay.
How are we handling the PII, the otherwise sensitive information that's existing in these data stores and ultimately the models? I think for me, that really becomes the chief concern. And from a governance perspective, as we think about, again, the context of our organization, in this case, the university, the college, how do we build in our regulatory requirements so that as we are developing and operating these models, those are always front and center so that we don't let ease of access, ease of use take priority over our obligation to protect the privacy of this sensitive information.
Got it. So it's really, yeah, I mean, it's really about recognizing the privacy, recognizing the controls that we need to have on that, and
That's
not
your
letting our hunger for innovation get ahead of the fact that we need to protect that data. Did I get that
either
right?
via anonymization, pseudonymization, whatever the appropriate technique is, we still need to protect those users, those consumers, prior to protecting the best interest of the organization.
Yeah, go deeper on that. So when you say anonymization, I mean, I think I've got a pretty good idea of what you mean by that, but explain for our audience what you're going after there.
We might think of it as de-identification. Having
Okay.
a data set wherein I cannot identify you, Matt Kirchner, from this row of information that I'm looking at
Right.
versus anyone else.
So I might say like bald guy who hosts who hosts a podcast in technical education, but not me specifically.
But not you specifically.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
but the key is many different elements, many different fields, many different properties can be used as a key identifier for you.
Sure.
As an example, what you just rolled out, I could use to piece together that, no, we're talking about Matt Kirchner. So
Right.
suddenly what seems like an easy way to de-identify you is actually a way that I can infer very quickly who you are.
Right. Got it. So, fascinating, and we could probably spend, a good 30 minutes just on that topic. We'll keep things rolling. Let's think about it this way. I think one of the things that we might hear from, whether it's, a private company that's trying to innovate using AI, whether it's an educator that's doing the same thing, all of this governance, I should say, all of these rules, all of these standards. It's hard enough to innovate in this day and age without having to comply with all of this stuff. What is your message to those individuals, and are there some benefits to compliance that actually speed innovation, which would seem counterintuitive, but as opposed to holding it back?
Yeah, and I think that, again, man, there are two different views. We can look at this as punishment, or we can look at this as the rules of the game, that the
Hmm.
quicker we learn and choose to play with, the quicker we can be successful. One of the analogies that I heard years ago that I think is very apt, very apropos for this conversation is the lines on a football field, the lines on a soccer pitch. We've got sidelines, we've got end lines, and those are not meant to be penalties. They're meant to be a clear indication of where you should move fast on the field and where you should stop moving because you're out of bounds of play, which is off the field. And so really and truly, that's what governance and that's what regulation provides us, is a clear indication of when we're out of bounds, when we should stop doing what we're doing because it's wasted effort, versus we're squarely in the field of play and we should be moving as quickly as humanly possible.
Got it. So love the soccer field, love the football analogy, because we're all about being sports fans here at the Tech Ed Podcast as well. But if I'm an organization that has defined what those guidelines are or what those limits are, tell us, maybe a practical example or how this feels in practice to set those expectations, to set those guidelines, and then to ensure compliance.
Outside the context of education, I think about business in the European Union, organizations
Okay.
that are delivering services to EU-based individuals, customers, whatever. We've got a system that's placed on the market delivering outcomes to the EU. We know right now the regulatory burden in the EU is through the roof. We've got the EU AI Act, which is at various stages of enforcement. We've long had GDPR, still a chief concern for organizations that are using data. We've got the Digital Services Act. The list goes on and on and
Sure.
on and on. So for businesses that do intend to deliver value to the market, to that market, they can start by really understanding their obligation in relation to those acts and determining if the juice is worth the squeeze. Is this an area in which we truly want to play? If so, let's make an informed decision to commit resources here. If not, let's not waste our time. Let's just understand, as an organization, we choose to geofence, we choose to isolate from customers in that market because we're not prepared to deal with the burden and the obligation.
Got it. So, just to draw again another manufacturing parallel, I remember, and this goes back a couple decades now, hard to believe, with the restriction of hazardous substances, which is a European Union directive, or the end of life vehicle directive, which was another one where, without getting too far into the weeds, hexavalent chromium was something that was used in a really broad sense, in a broad way in manufacturing, and as a sacrificial coating for steel. So it prevented corrosion and so on. And what we found was it wasn't long. Yes, Europe led on this. There were some really really strong restrictions. For a while, we were like, okay, well, we'll have this process for the US and we'll have this process for anything that's going overseas. And that became an absolute nightmare to manage. Two different processes, two different expectations. And so it wasn't long before it became just kind of globally restricted and it was way more aligned. Is that going to happen here in the US as well? You point to Europe, but are we seeing that?
So in the US, it's a little bit different in that states, through their state legislatures, have really taken lead on coming up with their own AI regulations. Man, really, the hard thing here, and the reason it's difficult to answer that question, is we do know, because of presidential executive order, that there is very likely going to be regulation that rolls back or pushes out of enforcement state
Right.
legislation. So it's really hard to say. It really is. But what I would say is the process, the act of governing, because we are forced to think through these things before we take action, still is the number one enabler of innovation in my mind, despite anything else that we might think should be the first step. The first step is, let's think about what it is we're trying to create,
Right.
and how we can optimize risk and cost along the way. Absent those things, again, we're shooting in the dark and hoping that we win.
Yep, absolutely. So, just for context, I spent, probably 9 months last year, 2024. It was a 2024, year before last. Sir, I was appointed by our state legislature here in Wisconsin to a study committee on artificial intelligence, and we
really?
had hearing after public hearing after public hearing. It's all available online. People can go back and watch the dialogue. All kinds of people from healthcare, from education, from law enforcement, from manufacturing, that came in and testified before that committee about regulation in artificial intelligence specific to the state of Wisconsin. And it was a really and this was, you think about 2 or 3 years ago, how far we've come in AI just in that period of time. So this was in the, kind of hard to believe, but in the early days of the AI revolution, which was only, 18 months or 2 years ago. But
Right.
and obviously things were going on before that. But we actually looked at the whole idea of regulation of artificial intelligence and explored all the privacy issues and explored the applications and the upside as well. Looked really closely. I'm sure you've spent some time on this as well. At the time, Colorado had some pretty stringent requirements around the use of artificial intelligence and data. Same could be said of California was looking at it pretty closely at that time. Ultimately, we here in the state of Wisconsin, the recommendation that we made to our state legislature, which they accepted, was that we didn't feel that any significant state level regulation was appropriate, in part because we didn't want to tie the hands of either the organizations within our state that were innovating in AI, or for that matter, organizations outside of our state, that as soon as you start having too many of these state regulations, you end up, getting blacklisted. You had a different term for it, but people are like, okay, I'm just not, I think you called it geofencing. We're just not going to do business there because of these regulations. We'll focus on the other 47 states where we've got a blue sky opportunity to innovate. So just thought of that. I don't know if you have a reflection on that particular thought.
Well, no, I see the same thing, Matt, for what it's worth. I too helped a little bit with consulting around educating around SB 205 in Colorado. Colorado's AI bill. Texas, in fact, has enforced today the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act. I was just in Austin last week and speaking with local residents, really almost no awareness whatsoever that this act is in force. So yeah. I mean, I do think from a state level perspective, because there is such a drive to bring in industry, it can seem overly burdensome and oppressive to have state level regulation, when in reality, to ensure that there's a level playing field, we really need to be looking to the federal government and some sort of federal regulation to ensure at a bare minimum we all agree on what safe is.
Yeah, no, you and I are aligned on that. I wasn't planning on going down that path, but this is a fascinating one to me, and that is, in our ed tech life, right? We have several ed tech companies totally separate from the media company and the podcast, but we do business in 7 states across the upper Midwest, and we're using a lot of AI and a lot of applications both on our product side and on the the market intelligence and sales and distribution side. And having to comply with one regulation or one set of laws would be really, really difficult. To have statutes across 7 different states that were all different in terms of what data you can use, how you can collect it, where you keep it, how you protect it. Imagine being a small company, as we are in the grand scheme of things. We're a big fish in a small pond, but smaller company, not a billion-dollar business with 10 people working on this, trying to comply with all those different regulations. So totally agree. If we're going to do this and do it well, it has to be at the federal level. And I would just suspect, again, having been through through it in other market spaces that we'll probably look to Europe and what they're doing, and we'll figure out what they did well, and we'll also figure out what they screwed up, and then we'll implement the best of both worlds. Is what I would suspect is going to happen.
I think there are clean examples of both today. Yes.
Exactly. So,
Yep.
a fascinating conversation around the whole regulation side of things. It'll be interesting to walk through that in the years to come, without question. The other thing that I think is really interesting to think about as we think about the future of artificial intelligence, and right now, in many cases, we're thinking about how do we get to market with solutions that are going to appeal to customers now, right? And we're not necessarily thinking about the whole life cycle of a product, right? I mean, we think about a manufactured product. To put it into context, if I'm selling a physical asset, I have to get it into the market. I have to train people on it. I have to show them how to use it. I have to think about what is the replacement for this? What happens when it comes to its end of life? How do we continue to innovate in the space? Is there thinking around life cycle for, whether it's design on the end to retirement on the other end around artificial intelligence? And if so, is that important, and why?
So I'll tell you right now, really the conversations around life cycle exist around defining the life cycle for AI development. And we'll see a standard software development life cycle with some small tweaks for AI.
Okay.
Largely, that's where the focus is in the SDLC itself. We will see deployment to production. We will see ultimate retirement, but largely that becomes a closed loop. As far as organizations that are using that as a foundation for a greater innovation strategy,
Mm-hmm.
just like context for the organization, there are so many different iterations and implementations of this. One thing I do think is interesting that we haven't talked about as it relates to innovation and ISO management systems is in late 2024, ISO actually released a standard for innovation management systems,
Okay.
ISO standard 56001.
What's an innovation management system for
It
starters?
is just that. It is a management system that the management body at an organization can implement to ensure that they're innovating in a structured, repeatable, and consistent way.
Okay.
So again, we think about governing AI, governing anything, create our desired outcomes at optimized risk and cost. You now have a mechanism to apply that concept to innovation in your organization.
Got
So
it.
very, very exciting.
If I'm innovating, let's just say on the software side, and I'm building AI capabilities into my software, and there are various steps that I have to go through to make sure that I'm doing that in a compliant and responsible way. What are those steps along the way, from ideation to programming and coding to beta testing to ultimate release? What are the things that developers should be thinking about vis-a-vis AI compliance, governance, and so on while they're going through that process?
So three kind of big categories that we'll
Okay.
see evidence themselves at virtually every step of the chain of our software development lifecycle. First of all, change management.
Mm-hmm.
We documenting what we're doing so we can backtrack, we can trace why decisions were made when.
Sure.
Next, impact and risk assessments.
Okay.
Those two things become really, really big, particularly when we're introducing change to existing products or when we're developing a net new product, to really take a hard look at the stakeholders that will be using this system and the potential harms that could befall them through an impact assessment, an AI system impact assessment specifically. Yep. And then secondly, the AI risk, based on where we are with this iteration, this stage of ideation, what risk are we really going to be taking on should this product ship to market? I think those three things will be the common themes that we'll see regardless of where we sit.
And I think back to my days of innovating around environmental control systems for mainly manufacturing and chemical companies, and we would talk about aspects and impacts, right? So what are the areas in which we're touching the environment? What are the potential impacts of those? And then categorizing and ranking our greatest risk, and then backing into here's where we need controls. Are you saying the same thing from a software development standpoint?
Exactly the same thing, Matt. What's the saying? There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
Ultimately, we're reusing old archetypes for new systems as we see them, but first principles always work. That's why we continue to come back to them.
Yeah, exactly. The best ideas are stolen. No need to reinvent the wheel. It's somebody else figured this out already. Let's not figure out our own version of it. When we get to that side of the AI risk, Patrick, and you're going through, all right, I figured out my potential impacts. I've got this risk of embedding AI in my product. What are some examples of things that innovators are looking at in terms of we need to assess where this risk is? What are some of the bad things that could happen that we're trying to mitigate?
Yeah, and I think first and foremost, one of the more visible is bias. So the disparate outcomes. Have we made a system that's making decisions that could materially impair some humans' ability to be successful in life? Are we taking away from humans? That's always going to be a big one that leads to reputational risk, reputational harm, things of
Yep.
that nature. But really when I think about security risk associated with systems, IBM has done a really good job to lay out this model where when we think of the socio-technical system that is AI, we've got all these people, all this technology, they work together to make AI what it is. IBM separates these risk layers into three components. So there's the data layer, where we have risks and vulnerabilities associated with the data that we're using.
Sure.
Is this data even good to begin with? Am I making decisions based on flawed information, garbage in, garbage out? We've got the models, that is the algorithms that are used that we're forcing data through to help us create the magic that is what we call AI. Then lastly, we have the human interface, what we might think of as the inquisition engine, what we might think of as the chat interface.
Sure.
What we see here is that humans still, it's amazing. It's like water finds a way. Humans continue to find ways to manipulate systems
For
that
sure.
otherwise appear to be hardened and impervious to malicious activity. But nonetheless, I think risk in the context of our conversation should be thought of in those three separate ways. What are the
Absolutely.
risks associated with the data we're using, risks associated with the models themselves, and then lastly, risks of opening our system up to others so that others might potentially take advantage or compromise that system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the work that I do in the certification world and thinking about, in other words, third-party certifications, certifying students and learners around specific competencies in all the work. In that case, another ISO 17024, I think, is the ISO standard
Sure.
that yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
applies
Yeah.
to certifications and all these questions about if I've got, you're in Knoxville, Tennessee, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, maybe another candidate for that certification lives in Los Angeles. Are we asking a question in a way that would be interpreted the same way for all three of us? Or maybe we've got different cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, whatever, making
Mhm.
sure that we're not building bias into the way that we're doing those assessments. And that resonated with me when you were talking about not building any bias into the data itself. And then the other one, I don't know if you've, I think it's called Gandalf, which is it's either an app or a website, I forget which, but I've got a family member who works in the world of AI and data science and introduced me to that. And it is a bot where essentially Gandalf, if I'm getting the name right, has the password you need. And you need to, by engineering your prompts in the right way, get it to give up the password. And it gets harder and harder the deeper you get into it. But
Oh my
literally, there's
goodness.
a whole game around doing exactly what you're saying, which is if I'm a bad actor, on the side of that prompt engineering and creating the right prompt, how am I thinking through how do I prevent that individual from maybe accessing data in a way that I don't want them to because they're out
Yeah.
thinking my agent or whatever the platform is that they're accessing.
Prompt injection is still the number one risk. I don't know if you saw this research hit. I think it was October or November of last year, so 2025, for those
Sure.
not listening in 26. Researchers had determined with the available public-facing models, so all the bigs, that they could between 70 to 90% efficacy violate guardrails by simply inserting their prompt for something bad in the form of a poem.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so as long as I injected this prompt in the structure of a poem, invariably, again, with some models, it was up to 90% of the time would return data that should have otherwise been protected.
Yeah, I mean that's just amazing. Yeah, it's absolutely, absolutely
It-
fascinating. It's scary, but
It's
it's
scary.
also just fascinating how creative people can be in terms of engineering their prompts. Yeah,
Well, and that's the thing that I think we forget. We see how amazing Nano Banana, how amazing some of these
sure.
tools are at creating new material and new content.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, our imaginations are still the most resourceful, most amazing things on this planet. It really is cool.
And we're going to use that as a pull quote. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And especially in this age of people are thinking, is AI going to usurp or replace creativity? And not anytime soon, according to some of the stories that we're just talking about. We'll ask Melissa to find all of that. But that's a couple of the studies you mentioned earlier, an MIT study, and now this study about 70 to 90% being able to get the LLM or the AI platform to give up the GPT, I guess I should say, to give up information that we don't want it to share just by injecting the prompt in the form of a poem. That's fascinating. So cool. Let's do a little role playing here, and I'm gonna be the CEO of a company, and I'm gonna be innovating a new product. And actually, it's a real situation in my case, and I'm innovating a product in the AI space, and I'm saying to you, Patrick, look, this all sounds interesting. I get the governance side, I get the
Mhm.
responsibility side, I understand it. I'm moving at light speed here, and I don't have time for all these rules and regulations. I'm a small company. Don't bother me with this. I'm just going to go. Convince me why I should be thinking about governance and compliance as opposed to just, pulling the ripcord and letting things happen.
Man, I know you're busy. I know things are crazy and you're being pressured to produce today. My question for you is, do you have time to start over from the beginning? Do you have time to rework products that you've already deployed to the market and now have to recall because you've recognized that you've created these products with some sort of fatal flaw that will cause harm? How important is that to your company's reputation? Is that something that's even of a concern, or do you just shutter your doors and open under a new name?
Well, of course, it's a concern. We kind of feel like we've mitigated for a lot of that already, and it just seems like there's a lot of structure and a lot of compliance. And frankly, if I'm running a small business and I'm accessing venture capital, certainly they want their investment protected as well. But they're all over us to just go, go, go. What's the ROI argument in favor of all of the compliance? I mean, I get not having something fail in the field. I feel like we've got that fairly well covered. What's the ROI in something like this?
On ensuring that you're protecting the investment, really and truly, the ROI will center around risk and rework today, and then protecting against reputational harm. Now, your investors, they're not concerned about potential reputational harm or losing their investment because of a failed deployment.
Well, I think they're probably just again role playing, convinced that they're in a position where, and we're in a position where we've put enough thought into that and don't want to slow the model down. Will this slow the model down?
It should not slow your model down. Really, what we're talking about doing is forming a plan before executing. So that plan doesn't have to be overly ornate, and that plan doesn't have to be something that stops you from producing. But what we're saying through governance is that you should have a plan that operates in your context with your current obligations and restrictions. So, Matt, I would ask, in lieu of governance, do you have a solid understanding of the totality of your customer requirements, those things that you've committed to through those agreements, in addition to the regulatory requirements you carry for the market that you operate within and the geography that you operate within?
So our audience can all get a good idea of why you're advocating for this in the way that you are, Patrick. And that was a fun little exercise for us to do because I'm sure you're getting those real world questions, right? Are you getting that kind of feedback?
The number one point of pushback that we get from organizations today is, well, my customers are not asking me for this. Why should I even care about it
Hmm.
today?
Yep.
And Matt, really and truly, 90% of the time, my response is they're not asking about it yet, and they will. So let's be proactive in this endeavor. What we see really are a couple different pools of organizations that are choosing to pursue certification today. Those startups and small market organizations that are either looking for investment from venture capital or private equity that really want to ensure that they're doing things in a structured way so that they can grow to meet the demands of their investors in their markets. And then at the enterprise level, we see enterprises more and more saying no to potential suppliers that can't prove through some sort of assurance documentation that they're developing and using AI responsibly. And so the next question would be, are you prepared to lose Microsoft as a customer? Are you prepared to lose Google as a customer because you don't want to implement governance practices?
Yep, and it's really, and I agree with everything you say. Obviously, we were playing the devil's advocate a bit through that conversation. And I think about in the days of ISO and compliance in the manufacturing realm, same kind of conversations, right? On product quality, on it's one thing for me to get through a beta test of a product and show you that I can produce it the way you're expecting it. It's another thing for me to show you that I've got policies, procedures, standard operating procedures, training requirements for my team, and that we're compliant with those because we have a third-party organization coming in every single year, or maybe sometimes even more often
Right.
than that, auditing our compliance and ensuring that we're living up to doing what we say part of that equation. So super, super important. And then the other argument again is someone who spends a lot of time on the VC side and the PE side as an investor and working with organizations with general partners, I should say, in private equity and venture capital funds, and an LP in them as well. If this can also be almost like a sales pitch to your VC partner to say,
No
look, we are
question.
compliant. We're mitigating this risk. A lot of the questions you might have about a foray into artificial intelligence and where that might end up, no guarantees for anybody, but we've really put the time in. So I would say it's almost more of a sales pitch than something that you need to convince them you need to do. They should be thinking about it as a risk mitigation tool.
Right. It's the answer to the question, can we create value more than once? It's great that you can create value once. Can you do this consistently and repeatedly? Man, we just went through the NFL combine. One of the things with the NFL that I think really, really parallels what we see in governance is that there is an expectation that people will perform. If you don't perform, I think the adage is the NFL stands for not for long if you're not producing.
Right. For sure. Yeah.
Right. So for those organizations that want to continue to play middle school and high school ball, maybe you do forego governance,
Hmm.
but I promise you, you will not be able to grow. You won't be able to mature to the point that you can perform with professionals without solid governance practices in place.
Yep, fair enough, and that's true. Certainly, in the age of AI innovation, serving on several corporate boards as well. Same argument, right?
Right.
We've got to have the rules. We've got to have a system in place to make sure that we're playing by them. Couple questions we have time for yet, Patrick. We love to ask this question of every guest, and that is that, what is something that you believe about education that might be a surprise or might be a little bit different for our listeners to hear?
So Joseph Campbell, and this might seem like an ill-fit quote for your question, but Joseph Campbell has this quote that you should follow your bliss. If you
Okay.
follow your bliss, doors will open where before there were only walls. And Matt, I would say my educational journey has really paralleled my work journey, which is I've followed those things that I'm most interested and most passionate about, and doors have just continued to open for me.
Awesome.
I made a commitment. I clarified my purpose 20 years ago that I exist to serve so that others can reach their full potential. And I realized that as long as I stay committed to that, whether it's in education, at work, at whatever, that good things just tend to happen.
Absolutely. Sticking to mission, and I learned that every day, right? As soon as you start setting your eyes on something other than the purpose you were put on this earth to achieve and
Right.
figuring out what that is and then staying on track with that, then, if you stay on that track, great things happen. If you get off that track, life has a way of reminding you that you're off track really quickly and pushing you
Really,
back to
really
where you
quickly.
need to go.
That's it, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So speaking of being on the right track, obviously, going all the way back to your youth, you ended up on a really cool track doing all this awesome innovation in the world of governance, compliance, and so on. So just a question for you, knowing what you know now, knowing that you followed your bliss, knowing that you know your purpose, if you could go back into that sophomore year of high school-ish, 15-year-old Patrick Sullivan and give him
Mhm.
one piece of advice, what would that be?
Trust yourself. I think one of the things that even business leaders today, some of your listeners might be feeling this, they might have a gut instinct that something is the right way to go, that a certain decision is the right way to go, but kind of fall in the face of opposition or choose to follow the populist route.
Hmm.
I would say believe in yourself and trust in yourself. I think we all have our own way of finding the truth through chaos. We all have our own strategy for that. I think the sooner leaders recognize that they can trust themselves, the more effective and efficient they can become as leaders.
No question, and the people that they're leading respond well to that, right? Because
There's
it's
no
one of the
question.
lessons that as soon as you're all over the map, as soon as people have an idea that you're not convicted in terms of your mission, in terms of your purpose, in terms of where the organization is going, if they think that you're questioning yourself, and sometimes you will, as soon as you're doing that, the whole organization is questioning itself, and
It's
it
a
doesn't mean you can't ask those questions, doesn't mean you can't redirect, doesn't mean that life doesn't have a way of maybe morphing that purpose a little bit as times change and so on. But the
the
truth of the
feedback.
matter is, yep, staying true to yourself, trusting your judgment, trusting that you're on this journey that's consistent with where you've been and where you're supposed to go. Super, super important in leadership. Certainly super important in a role that the kind of role that you have, Patrick, as Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at Align. Really cool conversation we've had today around, really, to me, bringing two of my worlds together. I'm fascinated by artificial intelligence. As you can probably tell, I've spent my time complying with ISO standards and ISO requirements and all the management practices that go along with them. So being able to bring those two worlds together has been really fascinating for me. Really appreciate you taking some time for us here on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Matt, grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
It's been awesome having Patrick Sullivan on the Tech Ed Podcast. I hope our audience found this as fascinating as I did. I know you did. You will, by the way, we mentioned a bunch of stuff on the show notes. We're going to link those show notes at techedpodcast.com/Sullivan. And then check us out on social media. We are all over social. You will find us on LinkedIn. We're doing a ton of stuff on YouTube these days. Lots and lots of reactions to the fact that people can now not just listen to the podcast, but see it on YouTube. We are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts. Wherever you go to consume your social media, you will find the Tech Ed Podcast. When you do, say hello, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Can't wait to hear from and see everybody again next week on the Tech Ed Podcast. Until then, I am Matt Kirchner, your host. Thank you for being with us.